Great people who did some not so great things. Like, very not great. You'll see what I mean. First up, Dr. Seuss. Turns out the man behind Green Eggs and Ham served up some seriously questionable behavior on the side. First, let's talk about Theodore Geisel's idea of loyalty. Yes, that's his real name. While his first wife Helen was battling a debilitating illness and severe depression, Geisel decided that was a perfect time to have an affair. Because nothing says in sickness and in health like breaking your vows, right? Helen eventually discovered the affair, and the devastation drove her to write a heartbreaking note before tragically ending her life. And what did Dr. Seuss do in the wake of this tragedy? He married his mistress less than a year later. That's one way to process grief. But it doesn't stop there. Before he was rhyming about Loraxes and Sneetches, Geisel had a darker artistic side. During World War II, he turned out a series of political cartoons that were blatantly racist, particularly towards Japanese Americans. He even supported the internment camps. It's hard to reconcile that with the guy who taught us that a person's a person no matter how small. And let's not forget the contradictions. This is the same man who later wrote stories about equality and acceptance, like the Sneetches, which carried a moral about rejecting prejudice. So, was it personal growth or PR redemption? We'll never know. But Horton hearing a Who suddenly feels a lot less heartwarming when you know what Geisel thought of real people. Next up, Einstein. The fellow who made E equals mc squared a household equation, and basically wrote the playbook for modern physics. But while he was busy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, his personal life was less scientific genius and more daytime soap opera. Let's start with his first wife, Mileva Marique. She wasn't just his spouse, she was also a physicist in her own right. Some historians believe Mileva might have contributed to his early breakthroughs, including his groundbreaking theories. So how did Einstein repay her? By treating her like an unpaid lab assistant, of course. While his name was going on papers and awards, hers wasn't even in the footnotes. And when their marriage started to crumble, Einstein did not try to fix things. Instead, he handed Mileva a list of conditions for staying married. This masterpiece of romance included demands like, "You will not expect any intimacy from me," and "You will keep the bedroom and study tidy." Because nothing says marital bliss like a man too busy for affection but very concerned about dusting. Eventually, she had enough and left. And Einstein, did he reflect, grow, and try to be better? Nope, he turned around and married his cousin, Elsa. Yup, the same guy who reshaped the way we see the cosmos, thought that keeping it all in the family was a perfect idea. Then, while married to Elsa, he didn't quite decide to walk a straight line. He had multiple affairs, often admitting to them in letters as if fidelity was some optional social experiment. Sure, the guy was a genius, but evidently, intelligence and emotional maturity are not related in any way. While he was redefining physics, he was also redefining what it meant to be a horrible partner. Winston Churchill, you know him, the cigar-smoking, speech-giving British leader who helped save the world in World War II. His never-surrender attitude kept Britain going when things looked hopeless. And honestly, he deserves credit for being a major reason the Nazis didn't win. But here's the thing. Churchill wasn't all speeches and glory. He made some really questionable decisions, and they weren't exactly tiny mistakes. Take the Bengal famine of 1943, for example. Millions of people in India died of starvation, and Churchill had the power to help. But instead of sending food, he redirected supplies to Europe and let grain rot in ports. His excuse? He blamed the famine on Indians, quote unquote, breeding like rabbits. That's not just insensitive, that is straight up cruel. While people were dying, their leader basically said, "Not my problem." Then there's the Tony Pandy riots in 1910, back when Churchill was Home Secretary. Coal miners in Wales went on strike for better pay, and Churchill sent in actual troops. These weren't violent rebels, they were just workers trying to survive. And the result was violent clashes that left a lasting scar in the community. Maybe sending in soldiers to deal with peaceful strikers was not the brightest idea. And let's not forget Dresden in 1945. Churchill ordered the bombing of the German city, which killed tens of thousands of civilians. The city was practically leveled, and historians say it didn't serve much of a military purpose. It looked more like revenge than strategy. Here's the deal. Churchill's leadership in World War II was incredible, and it's why he's remembered as a hero. But he also made decisions that caused a lot of harm. He wasn't perfect, no one is. It's just funny how the history books don't spend that much time on this stuff. Moving on to Thomas Edison, the so-called Wizard of Menlo Park, who's credited with inventing just about everything. The light bulb, phonograph, movies. But here's the thing. Edison's real talent wasn't inventing. It was marketing. Let's start with the light bulb. Edison didn't actually invent it. No, he just improved an existing design and got the patent. A genius? Sure. Original? Not so much. And this wasn't a one time thing, he did it over and over again, taking credit for the work of people like Joseph Swan, who'd been working on light bulbs before Edison even got started. And then there's Nikola Tesla, the poor guy who made the mistake of working for Edison. Edison promised Tesla $50,000 for fixing his machines, but when Tesla actually did it, Edison laughed it off and said, "Oh, that was just a joke." Can you imagine doing months of work only to get hit with, haha, just kidding? But the real drama was the war of the currents. Edison was pushing for his direct current DC system, while Tesla's alternating current AC was gaining traction. So what did Edison do? He went full petty mode. He spread lies about AC being dangerous and even electrocuted animals, including an elephant, just to make his point. Yep, the guy who brought us the light bulb also brought us public animal electrocutions. What a legacy. So, was Edison smart? Absolutely. But let's not ignore the fact that he was also a ruthless businessman who didn't mind stepping on a few necks, or electrocuting a few animals to get ahead. Next up, Gandhi, the man, the myth, the Mahatma. He preached nonviolent, self discipline, and being the change, but his personal life and beliefs didn't always match the glossy image that history handed us. Let's start at home. Literally. Gandhi's spiritual experiments involved sleeping next to naked young women, including his teenage grandniece, to test his chastity, because apparently controlling your urges is easier with your relatives in bed. Unsurprisingly, his wife, Kasturba, wasn't a fan of his methods, or his controlling behavior. When she had pneumonia, Gandhi refused to let her take penicillin because it wasn't natural. She died. Meanwhile, when malaria struck Gandhi himself, he took medicine without hesitation. Funny how his principles only applied when someone else was suffering. Then there's South Africa. While Gandhi fought for Indian rights, his opinions about black Africans were shockingly racist. For a man who preached equality, his actions suggested he wasn't interested in applying that philosophy universally. And let's talk politics. Gandhi's insistence on strict nonviolence during India's independence movement wasn't as noble as it sounds. While British forces were massacring civilians, Gandhi demanded restraint, even when fighting back might have saved lives. Some critics argue that his inflexible ideals prolonged suffering, making him as much of a roadblock as a leader. So, was Gandhi the saint he's made out to be? Not even close. He had ideas that changed the world, but behind the slogans and spinning wheels was a man whose flaws couldn't be ignored. So, Mother Teresa. You've probably heard that she's the saintly figure who helped the poor and the sick, right? Well, not so fast. There's a lot of stuff in her story that doesn't exactly scream perfect saint. Let's take a closer look. First off, her homes for the dying. These places were supposed to be about giving sick people care, but in reality, they were more like suffering warehouses. People were lying on cots in pain, and there was little to no medicine to help them feel better. Needles, reused over and over. And Mother Teresa, she thought this was a good thing. She literally said, "There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot, to suffer it like Christ's passion." Sounds wonderful, in theory, but not so much for the people actually screaming in agony. Then there's money. There's always money. She was amazing at fundraising. Rich people couldn't hand over their cash fast enough. But where'd all that money go? Not to improving those homes. Millions of dollars disappeared, tucked away in secret accounts. A former volunteer once said there was no transparency. Nobody knew where the money was going. That doesn't exactly scream responsible charity. She also had a few sketchy friendships. She accepted millions from Charles Keating, a guy who stole from elderly people. When someone pointed this out, she didn't give the money back. Instead, she wrote to the court defending him, saying, "I do not know anything about Mr. Keating's business dealings." She knew enough to cash a check. Her advice to poor women? She went to places where families were starving and told them to keep having more kids. Imagine struggling to feed the kids you already have and being told it's your job to have more. Not super helpful. Having said all that, Mother Teresa did dedicate her life to helping the poor. She gave up personal comforts and worked in some of the hardest conditions imaginable. She brought global attention to the struggles of the poorest people on earth. Her methods were questionable and sometimes harmful, but her commitment was something worth recognizing. Let's call her a mixed bag. Next is John Lennon, Mr. Beatles himself. The guy who told the world to give peace a chance while seemingly giving no one in his personal life the same courtesy. For a man who preached love, harmony, and nonviolence, his real life actions tell a very different story. First, let's start with his violent streak. Lenin openly admitted to physically abusing women, including his first wife, Cynthia. He confessed in a 1980 Playboy interview that he was a quote unquote hitter and had spent much of his early life consumed by uncontrollable anger. Cynthia endured years of emotional and physical abuse, which Lenin later tried to dismiss as part of his younger self. But let's be real, there is no excuse for that. And then there's how he treated his son Julian. While Lenin sang about peace and understanding, he openly neglected Julian after his divorce. In fact, Lenin admitted that he had practically no relationship with Julian, and callously referred to him as an unplanned mistake, compared to Sean, his planned son with Yoko Ono. Imagine being a child and hearing your father say that, publicly. That's not just bad parenting, it's emotional cruelty on another level. But Lenin's hypocrisy didn't stop there. He spent the late 1960s and early 1970s preaching world peace, but behind closed doors, his behavior was anything but peaceful. For example, his infamous 1974 Lost Weekend period, where he separated from Yoko, was riddled with drunken brawls and violent outbursts. At one point, he got into a physical altercation with a waitress at the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles after being kicked out for heckling performers. Yeah, the peace icon punched a waitress. So yeah, he gave us music that inspired the world, but his personal life often undermined everything he claimed to stand for. He was not a saint. MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., the man, the legend, and the one whose I Have a Dream speech totally redefined history. But as we've seen, legends aren't perfect. That doesn't mean that MLK wasn't a hero. He was just human, with a few messy chapters in an otherwise extraordinary story. Let's start with his PhD dissertation. In 1991, it was revealed that a few parts of it were plagiarized. And not in a, whoops, I forgot a footnote kind of way. Entire sections were lifted from scholars, like Paul Tillich and Edgar Brightman. Now, in MLK's defense, academic standards back then were more like vague suggestions. Boston University investigated and decided to keep his degree intact, basically saying that he changed the world, so let's call it a mulligan. Okay, fair enough. Then there's the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, who apparently made MLK his personal obsession. They wiretapped him, followed him, and claimed he had extramarital affairs. Hoover probably had ulterior motives, like being a colossal racist. But the FBI didn't just pull these allegations out of thin air. Records suggest that MLK's personal life had its complicated moments, including relationships outside his marriage. Not ideal, but also not exactly an uncommon story for men under immense pressure and in positions of power. But here's where it gets interesting. None of this dims his legacy. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. MLK wasn't some untouchable saint. He was a flawed, complicated man who still managed to move mountains. Alright, JFK, the guy whose face is on half the schools and airports in America. But maybe it shouldn't be. Let's talk about the affairs. These weren't just harmless flings, but a pattern of reckless infidelity. Marilyn Monroe was the most infamous, but JFK's list of lovers extended to multiple women, including Judith Campbell Exner, who had ties to mob boss Sam Giancana. Think about that. The President of the United States, during one of the most tense periods in global history, was sleeping with someone linked to organized crime. This wasn't a personal indiscretion, it was a potential national security threat. Then there's the sheer volume. Secret Service agents reported smuggling women into the White House, some barely vetted. Again, not a lapse in judgment, but a systemic abuse of power. While JFK was supposed to be focused on the Cuban Missile Crisis or civil rights, his attention was frequently elsewhere. Behavior that undermines the trust and integrity expected of a leader. His affairs turned what was otherwise a celebrated legacy into one mired in questions about his judgment. We'll talk about Walt Disney, the guy who created the happiest place on earth. That is, unless you happen to work for him or share different political beliefs. On the surface, he's all about magic and family values, but dig a little deeper and suddenly things get less bibbidi-bobbidi-boo and more, yikes. First up, his ties to the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. A far-right group so subtle they might as well have carried flashing neon signs that read, "We hate communists and maybe a few other groups too." This wasn't a casual, "oh, I attended one meeting" kind of situation. Walt was a proud member of this group, which was notorious for its staunch anti-communist stance. And by staunch, I mean they equated anyone wanting fair labor practices with a Soviet spy. The group also pushed anti Semitic rhetoric, which, if you're running an empire based on inclusivity and imagination, isn't a great look. And speaking of workers, the 1941 animators strike showed Walt's true colors. When his employees asked for better pay and working conditions, he didn't sprinkle magic pixie dust on their demands. Instead, he called them communists and radicals, then made it his mission to ruin their careers. Think of him as the original villain in the fight for workers' rights, but instead of twirling a mustache, he sicked the House Un-American Activities Committee on anyone who dared to cross him. Walt's approach to unions and his far-right affiliations paint a picture that's a lot darker than the one on Main Street, USA. Yeah, he gave us Mickey Mouse, but for his workers, this could not have been further from a fairy tale ending. Anyway, YouTube thinks that you'll like this video next, so click it. Also, subscribe.